When the royal attendants unwrapped the linen bandages from his chest, what they found was not a boy, not a king, but something between the two. His skin had turned the color of ash, split open in long, wet gashes that wept black fluid. The smell was unbearable, festering rot, soaked in sweet, perfumed oils. His face, once painted on coins and banners as England's boy savior, had hollowed into a skull. The court physicians said his lungs were melting from the inside. His bones stuck out like knives from beneath his robes. He no longer spoke. He wheezed every breath, rattling like a death rattle echoing through the palace halls. Yet he ruled. Even as death devoured him alive, Edward VI held the scepter. And what he whispered from his disease-ravaged throne wasn't mercy, it was fire. By the end of his short, horrifying life, Edward was no longer the pale cherub once adored by the people. He had become something else. A prophet of punishment. A martyr who wanted to take a kingdom with him to the grave. And he nearly did. Born in 1537, Edward Tudor was the only legitimate son of King Henry VIII, a boy whose birth was hailed as nothing short of divine intervention. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just days after his birth, sealing her sainthood in Tudor mythology. Edward was more than a prince, he was a symbol. The Protestant Reformation had found its vessel in the form of a golden-haired infant, wrapped in silk and prophecy. For a kingdom still bleeding from Henry's wars and church schisms, Edward was the chosen one. But the truth is far more disturbing. From the start, Edward was sick. Not the typical pale, frail, noble child of the time. He was something more cursed. Chronic fevers haunted his early years. Reports describe rashes, convulsions, coughing fits that lasted hours. His tutors noted his obsession with pain sin and divine punishment. He asked if dying in agony made one holier. He was not even 10. By the age of 9, Edward was king, and already intimately acquainted with the idea that pain brought power. He was watched constantly by courtiers, doctors, priests. His tutors fed him a steady diet of Calvinist dogma and classical discipline. He devoured tales of righteous vengeance, divine judgment, and the fires of hell. He learned to speak like a bishop and punish like a king, and as his body continued to fail him, he clung more tightly to the one thing he could control: belief. In private, he fasted and flogged himself. One servant claimed to have found blood on the floor near the boy's bed, but was silenced. Edward wrote long prayers in his own hand, always about death, purity burning. The concept of mercy never appears. He learned the language of salvation, but only through annihilation, and the court obeyed. What choice did they have? The boy on the throne was dying. Yes, but with every cough he seemed to grow more severe, more divine, more terrifying. The line between God's punishment and the king's will began to blur. He asked about sinners. He asked about heretics. He asked what happened when people disobeyed the Bible. And the answers he received excited him. They called him the English Josiah, a boy king, chosen to purify the land. What they didn't say out loud was that Josiah in the Bible brought sweeping reforms by tearing down shrines, slaughtering priests, and dragging false prophets into the streets. Edward knew the story well. He loved it. He underlined the part where Josiah smashed the bones of the dead upon their altars. As Edward's body weakened, his mind sharpened like a blade. He began to draft proclamations, call councils, and review executions. He asked why Catholic books still existed, why priests hadn't yet been hanged, why the Virgin Mary still had shrines. He wanted England not just reformed, but gutted and rebuilt in his own image, pure suffering, obedient. He began to sign death warrants. Death? He asked for names. He demanded that those who deny the truth be struck down like the dogs of Egypt. These are his own words written in a trembling hand. The court whispered, "He is dying, but he was more dangerous than ever." Because Edward had discovered something unholy. That a dying boy could become a god. That the stench of his own decay made men listen. That fear was more powerful than any royal decree. And so from behind a veil of linen and blood, England's child king began to build his own kingdom of fire. And the fires were only just beginning. Let me know when you're ready for part E2. A kingdom in miniature, a sick child with. By the time Edward VI turned 10, his signature had already sent people to their deaths. He could barely lift a sword, but his pen was soaked in blood. Underneath the illusion of a fragile angelic boy sat a cold, meticulous mind trained not for play but for judgment. His world was not toys and tutors. It was gallows councils and confessionals. Behind him stood the real power, his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector of England. Seymour controlled the court, but it was the boy's name that signed the laws. Edward watched his uncle wield his authority like a surgeon's knife, and he learned. He learned how to speak little but make men obey. He saw how fear moves faster than law, and when Seymour fell from grace accused of treason and executed, Edward didn't weep. He wrote in his journal coldly that his uncle had sought his own glory and was justly punished. This wasn't a diary, it was a report, a ledger, a child writing down executions like a butcher recording carcasses. When John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, took over as Lord President of the Council, he quickly realized the child on the throne was no mere figurehead. Edward demanded to be briefed. He questioned decisions. He proposed punishments harsher than the council dared suggest. When bishops hesitated to follow his religious reforms, he wanted them examined. That was a word everyone knew meant something darker. Examination under Tudor rule often meant torture. The rack, the boot, the press. He had been crowned with holy oil wrapped in silks, carried through a cheering London, but behind closed doors he ruled with the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a judge. His writings during this period are chilling. His youthful essays and state memos speak not of joy or hope, but of obedience, punishment, and divine wrath. He fixated on stories of God destroying cities of kings, killing false prophets, of the cleansing fire that purified nations. He once described the execution of a traitor as a lesson for the people that fear may plant virtue. There was nothing childish about him. He held daily audiences with bishops, ambassadors, and nobles twice his age, seated on a raised throne as they bowed and fawned before him. But Edward didn't crave their flattery. He craved their trembling. When a Catholic envoy questioned the legality of one of Edward's reforms, the boy king remained silent for a long time, just staring. Finally, he whispered, "You still believe in idols." That man was later denied passage out of the country. He died imprisoned of illness. Or so they said. Edward began keeping lists of nobles he considered lukewarm, of priests who were unsure of foreign agents who smelled of Rome. No one knew how closely he was watching until they felt the noose tightening around them. One ambassador reported back to his monarch that the king is like a small lion in a gilded cage, wounded, starving, but no less dangerous. What terrified the court most wasn't the way Edward issued orders. It was the way he observed. He would sit pale and still, watching his ministers with unblinking eyes as they debated. When one courtier wept after condemning an old Catholic friend, Edward only replied, "You have done what was righteous. Be glad." He was 11. As his body declined, the line between personal pain and religious zeal blurred. Edward didn't see his illness as a punishment. He saw it as sanctification. To suffer was to be chosen. To die was to join the saints. But before he died, he wanted to make England holy, even if it meant making it bleed. He wrote prayers that called for God's sword upon the unclean. He questioned why Protestants weren't burning heretics fast enough. His ministers, fearing scandal, tried to soften his proclamations, but Edward would not allow it. "Let the people know what God demands," he insisted. "The fire cleanses," and he meant it literally. Throughout his reign, bonfires were lit across England, not for celebration, but for incineration. Catholic texts, vestments, rosaries, even sacred relics were thrown into the flames. In some towns, the smoke could be smelled for miles. In London, people whispered that the Thames was cursed, its waters gray with the ashes of saints. Edward watched these reports with satisfaction. He wanted more. He began demanding more direct purges of men, not just objects. He asked questions like, "Why do we not arrest priests who still say Latin Mass?" or "Why does the Tower not hold more traitors?" He wasn't naive. He was creating policy with a scalpel. and the court followed because what else could they do? He had become a child king who could speak of mercy while signing death. He could smile while speaking of heretics. He could ask to play music while planning who should hang. By 12, he understood the numbers, how many barrels of oil it took to keep a pyre burning, how many soldiers were needed to crush a rebellious village, how much gold it cost to silence a bishop. His council tried to contain him, but they had already failed. Edward had learned too early that the throne was not about love, it was about fear. And fear, he found, was loyal. England had handed him a crown. He had turned it into a weapon, and his body decaying, coughing, trembling, was becoming something far more powerful than anyone imagined. In the final year of his life, King Edward VI ruled not from a throne, but from a sickbed that reeked of sweat infection and clotted blood. His chamber doors remained shut for weeks at a time, guarded not just by armed sentries, but by the stench of a body breaking itself apart. His once bright skin had turned yellow-gray. His breath came in ragged gasps. Every cough sounded like a dagger driven into flesh. The boy who had demanded fire for heretics was now burning from the inside out. The official diagnosis, as far as any Tudor physician could make sense of it, was consumption tuberculosis. But that single word couldn't contain what was happening to Edward. His body was unraveling. One doctor described his lungs as weeping sores. Another spoke of the black blood that floods him when he tries to speak. His fingernails detached, his hair thinned, sores appeared on his chest, then his back, then across his thighs. Some burst, others never healed. Fever came in waves accompanied by bloody vomit and nights of incoherent screams. He hallucinated fire on the walls. He claimed to see angels not with joy but terror. "They come for me too early," he muttered once, gripping a servant's hand hard enough to draw blood. Despite it all, he still insisted on ruling. Each morning, after an hour-long ritual of cleansing, dressing, and medicating, Edward was propped upright with pillows and made to read state documents. His coughing fits often interrupted council meetings, sometimes causing blood to spray across his robes. Yet no one dared move. No one dared suggest rest. When a lord hesitated to hand him a proclamation due to the risk of contamination, Edward simply stared at him until the man trembled and obeyed. The monarch had become a shrine of sickness. His very presence was both holy and horrifying. Some whispered he was cursed, others that he was being tested by God. But everyone agreed on one thing. England was no longer ruled by a boy, it was ruled by a corpse with a crown. His physical decay only seemed to intensify his religious fervor. He demanded longer prayers, stricter laws, harsher sentences. He questioned why heretics were allowed to rot in prison instead of being burned. He spoke of sin in new ways, less as a transgression and more as a contagion. It must be cut out, purged, incinerated. He rewrote portions of the Book of Common Prayer, asking for new wording that emphasized eternal punishment and divine wrath. When one bishop protested that these changes were too grim for the faithful, Edward replied, "Then let the faithful toughen their souls as I have done." That bishop retired shortly after. No one dared object again. The more Edward's body failed him, the more brutal his decisions became. He ordered mass arrests of anyone accused of maintaining papist sympathies. Churches were searched, households were raided, even private prayer was policed. Rumors spread that children were denouncing parents. In one chilling case, a woman was burned alive for owning a candle marked with the Virgin's image. Her children, forced to watch, were told this was God's justice. And Edward watched it all from a bed soaked in pus and pain feeding off the control he could still exert. He was dying, but every scream from the street reminded him that he still had power. Doctors tried leeching, boil lancing, bloodletting. They gave him mercury arsenic powdered deer antler, anything that might drive out the rot. Nothing worked. His urine turned dark. He began to reek of decay. Attendants fainted while changing his bandages. One collapsed after glimpsing the infection on his back. From then on, all servants entering his room were required to wear cloths soaked in vinegar over their faces. And still he ruled. His letters became erratic but no less terrifying. In one he wrote, "God strips the flesh to free the soul. I am nearer to heaven now, and I see clearly. England must be scourged." In another, written in trembling blood-stained ink, he asked, "Will my death purchase salvation for the realm?" His council, now visibly shaken, tried to temper his actions. But Edward, now more fanatic than ever, responded with threats. He reminded them that they held power only because he allowed it. One courtier who suggested the boy should abdicate and rest was found disgraced, imprisoned, and later dead suicide, the record said. But no one believed it. By now, Edward's physical appearance had become unbearable. His cheeks sunken, his lips cracked and bloody, his voice barely a whisper, yet his words cut deeper than ever. "England is not sick," he once rasped. "Only I am, and one will heal the other." There was no healing coming. The disease consumed him inch by inch, but it also fed him. Every day closer to death made him feel closer to God. He began to speak in riddles sometimes, reciting scripture backwards, sometimes muttering about flames and swords. He kept a dagger beside his bed, not to defend himself, but as a reminder. God used the blade, he told a physician. So must I. He saw himself as a martyr king, a holy weapon. His suffering, he believed, was proof that he had been chosen. But chosen to do what? That was the question no one dared ask. Because England was watching the boy on the throne rot away and praying that whatever he was becoming wouldn't survive long enough to finish what he'd started. In the year before his death, Edward VI passed more religious laws than any other English monarch had in such a short span. Not laws of tolerance, not laws of unity. These were decrees soaked in fire and iron orders that would burn, mutilate, and erase anything that hinted at the old faith. The boy who lay trembling in blood-stiff sheets had declared war on an entire belief system, and his enemies were no longer armies or foreign kings. They were schoolteachers, midwives, old women clutching rosaries in secret. They were anyone who dared whisper the name of the Virgin or cross themselves in Latin. Edward believed God was watching him, judging him moment by moment, and if he faltered, the punishment would be swift and eternal. He had to purge. Not just his body, but the nation. The Book of Common Prayer was rewritten and reimposed with a blade. Where once there was symbolic reform, now there was pain. Priests who refused to use the new liturgy were stripped, flogged, and hanged. Church walls were scraped bare, their statues smashed by mobs. Graveyards were ransacked, bones tossed aside if they bore a Catholic cross. Monasteries that had survived Henry's wrath were finished under Edward's iron will. All of it was done in the name of a sick child. He passed laws forbidding Latin masses, outlawing Catholic rites of passage, and criminalizing the possession of papist relics. Even holy water was banned. In some towns, elderly villagers, many who couldn't even read, were arrested for clinging to the old rituals. They were beaten until they confessed, then burned. The fires were public, purposeful, a spectacle of cleansing. One notorious case in Kent involved a widow named Agnes, arrested for lighting a candle to Our Lady. Her accusers claimed she had muttered a Marian prayer. She was dragged before a tribunal and sentenced to death. At her execution, witnesses said the fire was slow to take. She screamed for nearly an hour. Edward was informed by letter. His only reply, "Let the fire teach the living." There was nothing accidental about the cruelty. It was policy, approved by a dying child with shaking hands and a holy mission. He came to believe that England was a battlefield for souls and he its general. But instead of leading armies, he sent preachers, spies, and executioners. The land became littered with informants, neighbors reporting neighbors, servants accusing masters. Confessions were extracted in darkness, punishments carried out in public daylight. Edward's language shifted in these final months. He no longer spoke merely of reform. He spoke of a final war, of a reckoning of flames that must rise higher. He asked his bishops why Jews had not yet been expelled. He asked why anyone still dared to question the divinity of the Book of Common Prayer. He questioned whether burying Catholics in consecrated ground defiled the earth, and those closest to him began to tremble. The Duke of Northumberland, his chief advisor, tried to temper the boy's zeal. He began quietly reversing some of the harsher orders. When Edward learned of this, he flew into a rage. Not with shouts, but with chilling calm. "The blood of the righteous is on your hands," he whispered. "Will you be judged as I will be judged?" Northumberland backed down. He would not challenge the boy again. It was becoming harder to explain to foreign envoys what was happening in England. The Spanish ambassador wrote home that the king is unwell, but the flames he lights grow stronger as his body fades. France began to doubt the boy's capacity for diplomacy. Rome issued condemnations, but Edward didn't care. He welcomed it. He declared that all idolaters must be removed from government. Half his council was purged in 2 weeks. In one chilling moment recorded by a courtier, Edward asked if those who burned slowly screamed more honestly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even children were not spared. Schools were ordered to teach only the new catechism. Any teacher who resisted was arrested. In one village, 3 students ages 11 to 13 were brought before magistrates for secretly saying the Ave Maria. Their teacher was hanged. The students were whipped in the town square and branded. Branded. Under orders signed by a child. Edward no longer smiled. He no longer laughed. He spoke softly sometimes, barely audibly, and yet his words held the weight of a noose. Those who visited him reported a room choked in incense and vinegar to mask the rot. His skin had broken out again, raw patches on his neck and arms, yet he continued to write decrees to demand answers, to summon bishops to kneel beside his sickbed and swear loyalty. Some believed Edward was no longer making these choices, that others were ruling in his name. But the surviving letters filled with personal scripture references, and his unmistakable hand prove otherwise. This was not a puppet regime. It was a holy inquisition led by a boy who thought himself God's dying sword. And then came the most disturbing change of all. Edward began to ask his ministers about Mary, his Catholic half-sister, and what might happen if she lived to rule. "Will she undo my work?" he asked one night. The reply was cautious. "She may seek peace, your majesty." Edward shook his head. "Then peace is the enemy." He had begun planning for something darker. A purge not just of faith, but of blood. And as the fire spread across the land, few dared question the monster their little savior had become. By the spring of 1553, Edward VI's bedchamber had transformed into something that no longer resembled the sanctified space of a monarch. It had become a rotting tomb. The tapestries hung heavy with the stink of infection. The walls, once vibrant with royal heraldry, were now blotched with damp and mildew. Physicians came and went wearing gloves soaked in vinegar. Some refused to enter the room at all. The stench of death had begun to settle into the stone itself. But Edward refused to die. He clung to life with a fanatic's desperation. He believed he knew that God would not take him until his holy work was done. Even as his organs failed, even as the ulcers on his body multiplied and burst like overripe fruit, he ordered updates from the tower, the prisons, the bishops. "Who still defies the book?" he asked. "Have they confessed? Have they burned?" But now Edward wasn't just ruling by edict. He was being haunted. The first whispers of his visions came from the servants' maids, who heard the king muttering to himself in the dark, calling out names that no longer existed. Then came the night terrors, screams that split the silence like the shriek of a wounded animal. Night after night, Edward thrashed beneath blood-soaked linens, eyes wide open, screaming about fire knives demons with black mouths. He began to claim that angels were visiting him, but not the comforting kind. These were cruel, flaming things that spoke in riddles and pointed at his chest. "They say I'm not finished," he whispered to a priest. "They want more blood." The priest resigned 2 days later. Hallucinations grew worse. He begged to have all mirrors removed from the room. When asked why he wept, and said, "There is something in them that watches me breathe." The windows were covered, torches dimmed. His meals, when he could eat, were served cold and left at a distance. Once he asked his guards if anyone else could hear the scratching behind the walls. "They're in the stone," he said, "trying to crawl into my body." But the most horrifying detail, he began to believe that the devil had taken root inside the palace itself. He ordered a full cleansing of the royal chapel, instructing priests to chant for 40 nights straight. No one was allowed to enter without blessing themselves. At one point he ordered his bed burned and replaced with a new one carved from a single piece of Holy English oak. When the carpenter protested the cost and effort, Edward had him arrested. The man vanished into the tower. The boy who had once played courtly games in Hampton Court now slept on an altar of pain. He began scribbling notes in the margins of Bible's notes about devils, about fire, about a beast in scarlet who would rise after his death. He spoke of Mary again and again, not as a sister, but as a blasphemous force of darkness. She drinks the old blood, he wrote. She speaks to the bones of Rome. His illness had twisted fear into prophecy, and prophecy into paranoia. He insisted that food be tested 3 times before touching it. Trusted advisors were suddenly replaced. Letters from the Queen Dowager were intercepted and burned. He accused one physician of trying to poison him with pagan salts. That doctor was found gagged and bound dead in his quarters, officially a suicide. By now, Edward's body was no longer that of a child. It was skeletal, bloated in strange places with skin that peeled like old bark. His lips were so cracked they bled when he spoke. The sores on his torso were leaking through his bandages. Nurses whispered of maggots near the base of his spine, but this was never confirmed. He wore layers of silk and fur to hide the degradation, but it fooled no one. He needed 2 attendants just to sit upright. His eyes had sunken deep into his skull, and his breath came in sharp, wheezing sobs. Yet in this state he continued to issue commands with unwavering certainty. Then came the blood. The coughing fits, once intermittent, now came in torrents. Dark, viscous blood spilled from his mouth and nose. Sometimes it choked him mid-sentence. He began writing more than speaking, often in shorthand and always accompanied by phrases like, "They come," or "The hour is near." Visitors were horrified. Diplomats refused audience. Nobles sent proxies. The court began to crumble beneath the weight of whispered terror. One woman, a lady-in-waiting, reportedly said, "He has become a holy corpse that rules from a pit of sickness. God help us when he dies." Yet Edward had no plans to die quietly. He was convinced that a final act was required, a gesture so holy, so purifying, that it would erase every speck of rot from England. And the more he suffered, the more he saw himself not as a victim, but as a vessel. Pain wasn't punishment, it was instruction. The angels, real or imagined, were speaking louder now. The flames of judgment were licking at the palace walls. Soon the boy would try to take one last swing at the world that had failed to become pure. A dying king, a poisoned prophecy, and a plan that would hurl England into the most disastrous succession crisis it had ever known. By early June of 1553, Edward VI knew he was dying. The doctors no longer hid it. The priests no longer lied. The boy king who had ruled through fire, fear, and fever was now sliding toward the grave. But Edward wasn't preparing to meet God with peace in his heart. He was preparing to rewrite history with his last breath. He didn't see his death as the end. He saw it as the final trial, the last test of his divine mission. And to pass that test, he needed to make sure that after his flesh rotted into the earth, his ideas would not. The crown must not fall into Catholic hands. That was his obsession. And in his twisted, half-delirious mind, that meant one thing: his sister, Mary Henry VIII's eldest daughter, devoutly Catholic, must never become queen. She was in his eyes the Antichrist in a Tudor dress. So Edward did what few child monarchs have ever done. He attempted to rewrite the line of succession, not with Parliament, not through negotiation, but by will force and paranoia. From his sickbed surrounded by the reek of infection and the moans of a dying body, Edward summoned quill and parchment and began to draft what he called "my devise for the succession." It was a fever dream written in royal decree. The document stripped both of his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, of their claims to the throne. It claimed they were illegitimate, unworthy, possibly even corrupted by foreign influences. Instead, Edward named his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane was a Protestant, young, easily manipulated, and more importantly, malleable. Edward believed he could preserve England's purity through her pass on the torch of righteousness, even as his lungs filled with blood. He pushed through the document with maddening speed. His handwriting grew sloppier, more frantic. His fingers trembled, his ink smeared with coughs. Witnesses described him gripping the quill until his nails tore from their beds. But he finished it. Then he began the purge. Anyone who objected to the new succession was marked. Some were arrested on the spot. Others disappeared in the night. The council chamber turned into a chamber of silence. Ministers who once guided the king now bowed their heads and nodded like frightened children. The Lord Chancellor hesitated. He was summoned to Edward's bedside, where the boy reportedly looked at him with black-ringed eyes and whispered, "If I burn in hell for you, you shall scream beside me." The Chancellor signed. Parliament had no time to approve the devise. Edward didn't care. He began issuing letters to key nobles, bishops, and foreign ambassadors declaring Lady Jane as his rightful successor. He called her the true daughter of God's nation. He ordered preparations for her coronation to begin immediately. But he wasn't done. Edward began ordering a new wave of arrests. Suspected Marian supporters were rounded up. Some were clergymen, others minor nobles. One elderly judge who refused to support Jane was stripped of his title and dragged into the Tower. Another was found dead in his home, poison suspected. He created what would later be known as the Final List, a ledger of names he believed would oppose Jane's rule. Many of them were women, wives of Catholic peers, nuns, widows who had influence in local parishes. Their crime, papist loyalty. He signed their warrants with the same broken, spidery scrawl he used to compose prayers. Even his own household was not safe. One of his attendants, just 16, was tortured for allegedly smuggling a letter from Mary. His tongue was torn out before he was executed, all under Edward's seal. Edward no longer saw England as a country. It was a battlefield of souls, and every soul that might undo his vision had to be extinguished before he drew his last breath. He summoned Lady Jane Grey to court. She arrived in silence, dressed in black, unaware of what awaited her. Edward greeted her with a faint smile, perhaps the first genuine one he'd offered in months, and placed in her hand a Bible stained with his own blood from a coughing fit. "Rule as I have," he whispered, "and fear not the fire." She cried. Within days, Jane was named heir. The palace was shuttered. Messages were dispatched across England. The death of the boy king was imminent, and when he passed, there would be a new queen, an untested girl backed by a dying child's rage and the weight of a nation smothered in religious fear. But Edward had miscalculated something. He believed he had stripped Mary of all power, that his words, his list, his purge would hold. That fear would be stronger than blood. He was wrong. Mary was already moving, already gathering support, already preparing for a reckoning that would come sooner and faster than anyone expected. But Edward would never live to see it. He had scrawled his death sentence across a kingdom, left his disease in the laws, and passed his fire to an unwilling heir. He was ready. At least he thought he was. He had made his death holy, or so he believed. By the summer of 1553, King Edward VI no longer resembled a human being. He was a mass of skin and bone, a living corpse, whose every breath gurgled through decaying tissue. His body had become a battlefield, not just of disease, but of judgment, a twisted relic of divine punishment. The boy king who once rode through London in golden robes now lay naked beneath linens, soaked in his own fluids, gasping and twitching as the rot consumed him from the inside out. His face, once delicate and princely, had collapsed. The flesh around his eyes had withered, turning his gaze into a hollow, haunted stare. The sores on his chest had opened wide enough to reveal rib and muscle. They were cleaned twice daily, though cleaned was a generous term. Attendants wore gloves and masks soaked in camphor. One collapsed mid-procedure. Another vomited after lifting his shirt. His lungs bled constantly. The coughs came in waves, wet, choking, frothing with infection. Often blood would burst from his lips while he slept, leaving red stains like petals across his pillow. He stopped eating. His tongue swelled. His lips blackened. Even when he whispered, it sounded like bone being scraped across stone. And still, he gave orders. He asked in rasping hisses for one final heretic to be burned. A woman in York, an old midwife accused of performing baptisms in Latin. He ordered it personally, scrawling the warrant in a trembling hand, barely legible through the splatters of blood. Let her feel what God demands, he wrote. Even in death he wanted flames. The physicians tried everything. Poultices of powdered pearls and myrrh, tinctures of gold leaf and antimony. They sliced open his abscesses. They cauterized sores with hot irons. One doctor in desperation applied crushed emeralds to the ulcers on Edward's legs. Nothing worked. The skin kept dying. The smell became unbearable. By the final week, the king's body had begun to exude a syrupy yellow fluid. His fingernails had turned black and curled. His gums bled when he moved his mouth. His breath smelled of rot, an unmistakable scent of death that lingered in the hallway outside his chamber. He was not allowed to be seen in public. The palace began to empty. Nobles found reasons to leave. Ambassadors postponed visits. Even his own council limited appearances to the bare minimum. But Jane Grey was summoned one last time. When she entered the room, she reportedly gagged at the scent. Edward could no longer sit upright. He lay there swaddled in silk with sunken cheeks and blood-crusted nostrils, his chest rising like a bellows on the verge of collapse. And yet he lifted his hand, a skeletal, trembling claw, and took hers. "You are the flame," he rasped. "Burn brighter than me." She wept. He laughed, a dry, wheezing sound that sent fresh blood spurting down his chin. He slept only in fragments, waking in panic, screaming about bones and fire and the black gates. He thrashed, tore his bedsheets, begged the angels to wait. Not yet. Not until the blood runs clean. His prayers turned manic. He mumbled psalms backwards. He cursed Mary by name. He died on July 6th, 1553. But the story didn't end with death. His body, now bloated and discolored beyond recognition, was left to decay in secret. There was no grand procession, no saintly lying in state. He was buried quietly in a Protestant ceremony so rushed and joyless that it bordered on sacrilege. No incense, no holy water. Just a box lowered into earth as the stench of decomposition clung to the mourner's clothes for days afterward. The palace was scrubbed, walls repainted, carpets burned. Physicians paid off to stay silent. But no one forgot. Because Edward VI didn't just die. He infected England. His laws, his purges, his paranoia, they remained. The Protestant reforms he enforced with a dying fist would become the spark of a religious war that would tear the country apart for generations. And worse, his final act, the elevation of Lady Jane Grey, unleashed a catastrophe. Within days of Edward's death, Mary Tudor struck back. With the fury of a betrayed daughter and the certainty of her own divine right, she marched to claim the throne. Jane Grey's reign lasted 9 days. Then came her imprisonment, her trial, her execution. The blood Edward spilled did not protect his legacy. It cursed it. And yet, in whispers in corners of the court, they still spoke of him. Not with reverence, but with fear. They remembered his voice, the way he spoke of fire, the way he watched men burn, the way he smiled at death. He had become the youngest king in English history to rule in his own name. But in the end, what people remembered wasn't the name. It was the stench, the silence. The boy with the crown and the corpse beneath his skin. Edward VI left behind no children, no monuments, no great victories. What he left was far more haunting a country trembling from the aftershock of a boy's divine obsession, and a trail of ashes that smoldered long after his frail body was swallowed by the grave. His reign had lasted just 6 years, and yet its echoes filled the centuries that followed. He had turned the pulpit into a scaffold, the altar into a pyre. England had been his canvas, and he had painted it with blood. And when he died decaying, disfigured and delirious, his nightmare didn't die with him. It evolved. Lady Jane Grey, his chosen heir, was dethroned and executed after only 9 days. Mary the Fierce and his Catholic half-sister seized power and began her own counter-purification, burning Protestants in the same flames Edward had used against Catholics. England became a pendulum of terror swinging violently between two extremes. And at the heart of it all, like a festering ghost, haunting the crown, was Edward the Boy King, whose sickness was never just of the flesh. Historians have tried to reframe his legacy. Some call him a precocious child manipulated by ambitious men. Others see him as a tragic victim, a pawn of political cruelty. But the truth is darker, colder. He was aware. Fully, intimately, unflinchingly. His writings are not the ramblings of a helpless child. They are declarations, edicts, judgments. They are the words of a monarch who understood fear and used it like a sword, who saw his own mortality as license to punish, who believed that suffering his and others was holy and necessary. He died at 15, but ruled with the fury of a prophet in flames. And the England he left behind had scorched earth where compassion once lived. His final words, whispered so faintly they had to be repeated by a servant, were reportedly, "Lord, receive my spirit and cleanse this land with fire." Whether he meant purging sin or burning it all down remains uncertain. But one thing is clear, Edward VI, the rotting boy king, did not simply die. He infected the crown, and every monarch after him would have to wear it, knowing that once it sat on the head of a child who ruled like death itself. Thank you for watching. If this story haunted you, if you felt the chill of forgotten history creeping into the present, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more dark tales from the shadows of power. Drop a comment below. Was Edward a victim of fate or a child tyrant cloaked in prophecy? And remember, behind every golden crown there might be a skull, too rotten to touch. Until next time, sleep with one eye open.